Let's begin by understanding something fundamental. An oil crisis does not suddenly appear. It builds. It develops quietly, layer by layer, decision by decision, until one day the world feels its full weight. And if we are honest, it is rarely just about oil. It is about power, dependence, and the consequences of how we have chosen to organize our world. You see, oil sits at the center of modern civilization. It fuels our cars, powers industries, drives global trade, and supports the very systems that define economic growth. But here's the deeper truth. When something becomes that central, it also becomes a point of vulnerability. Because the more we rely on one resource, the more exposed we become when that resource is disrupted. One of the most significant causes of oil crises lies in geopolitical tension. Oil is not spread evenly across the globe. It is concentrated in regions that often carry political complexity. When conflict emerges, whether through war, sanctions, or strained diplomatic relationships, the flow of oil becomes uncertain, and uncertainty, more than scarcity itself, is what shakes the global system. Markets react not only to what is happening, but to what might happen. Fear enters the equation, and once fear takes hold, it amplifies every disruption. But let's go deeper than politics. Because while conflicts may trigger crises, they are not the sole cause. Another powerful force at play is control, specifically the control exercised by major oil-producing nations and alliances. When production levels are adjusted even slightly, the effects ripple across the world. Prices rise, supply tightens, and economies begin to feel pressure. What's fascinating here is that the system is so sensitive that it doesn't take a massive shift to create a global reaction. A small decision in one part of the world can redefine economic conditions everywhere. And then there are the factors we often overlook: natural disruptions and infrastructure limitations. A storm damaging offshore rigs, a pipeline malfunction, or even technical failures in refineries can interrupt supply chains. In isolation, these might seem manageable, but in a system that operates with little margin for error, these disruptions can escalate quickly. It's like a tightly stretched rope. Pull it just a little too far, and it snaps. Now here's where the conversation becomes more philosophical, because we have to ask ourselves, why are we so vulnerable in the first place? And the answer is not just external, it's internal. It's rooted in human behavior and collective decision-making. For decades, we have prioritized efficiency over resilience. We've built systems designed to maximize output and minimize cost, assuming that stability will always be there. But stability is never guaranteed. And when a system is optimized only for efficiency, it often lacks the flexibility to absorb shocks. That's exactly what we see in an oil crisis, a system under stress, struggling to adapt because it was never designed to handle disruption at that scale. There's also a psychological pattern at work. As human beings, we tend to respond to urgency, not possibility. When oil is abundant and prices are low, the idea of a crisis feels distant, almost theoretical. There's no immediate pressure to change, no strong incentive to explore alternatives, so we continue comfortably within the systems we know. But when disruption hits, when prices surge and shortages loom, suddenly the urgency becomes real. And by then, the cost of inaction is already being paid. This cycle, comfort, neglect, crisis, reaction, is not accidental. It reflects a deeper tendency to delay difficult decisions until they become unavoidable. And in the case of oil, that delay has long-term consequences. Because every time we postpone diversification, every time we ignore the need for alternative energy, we deepen our dependence. So when we talk about the causes of an oil crisis, we have to move beyond the surface-level explanations. Yes, there are wars, policies, and supply disruptions, but underneath all of that is a pattern of thinking, a mindset that values short-term convenience over long-term stability. And that's where the real challenge lies, because solving the oil crisis is not just about increasing supply or stabilizing prices. It's about changing how we think about energy, risk, and responsibility. It's about recognizing that dependence, if left unchecked, always leads to vulnerability. The question then is not whether another oil crisis will occur. History tells us it will. The real question is whether we will continue to respond the same way, or whether we will finally learn to anticipate, adapt, and evolve. Because at the end of the day, the oil crisis is not just a problem of resources, it is a test of awareness. And if we don't change the way we think today, we will keep paying the price tomorrow. Now, once we understand the causes, we have to face the consequences. And this is where the conversation becomes impossible to ignore. Because an oil crisis does not stay confined to energy markets. It expands outward, quietly at first, then forcefully, until it begins to reshape the entire global economy. Think about it this way. Oil is not just another commodity. It is embedded in nearly every stage of economic activity, from the moment raw materials are extracted, to the manufacturing of goods, to the transportation that delivers them to markets. Oil is there. So when its price rises, it doesn't move in isolation. It pulls everything else up with it. And this is where inflation begins to take hold, not as an abstract economic term, but as a lived reality. The cost of transporting goods increases, which raises the price of those goods. Businesses facing higher production costs pass those costs on to consumers. And suddenly, what used to be affordable becomes expensive, not because the product itself has changed, but because the energy behind it has. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. Inflation doesn't just affect prices, it affects behavior. When people begin to feel that their money no longer stretches as far, they change how they spend. They become more cautious, more selective, and while that might sound responsible on an individual level, on a large scale, it slows down economic activity. Demand weakens. Businesses earn less. Growth begins to stall. This is how an oil crisis can quietly transition into an economic slowdown. But the impact is not evenly distributed. Developed and developing economies experience this pressure in very different ways. Wealthier nations often have stronger financial systems, larger reserves, and more diversified energy sources. They feel the strain, yes, but they have buffers. They can absorb the shock, at least for a while. Developing countries, on the other hand, face a much harsher reality. Many rely heavily on imported oil, which means rising global prices translate directly into national financial stress. Governments are forced to spend more on energy, often at the expense of other critical areas like healthcare, education, or infrastructure. Currencies weaken, debt increases, and economic stability becomes fragile. And here's the deeper issue. When basic costs like fuel and transportation rise, it affects everything else. Food becomes more expensive because it costs more to produce and distribute. Public services become harder to maintain. And for ordinary people, the pressure becomes personal. It's no longer about global markets. It's about daily survival. Now let's take a step back and look at the broader system. The global economy is interconnected. No country operates in isolation. So when oil prices surge, the effects ripple across borders. Trade slows down because transportation becomes more expensive. Supply chains become strained. Industries that depend heavily on fuel, like aviation, shipping, and manufacturing, begin to struggle. And when key industries struggle, employment is affected. Jobs are lost, incomes decline, and uncertainty grows. This is how an energy crisis evolves into a social and economic challenge. But there's also a psychological dimension to all of this that we often overlook. Markets are not driven by numbers alone. They are driven by perception. When investors see rising oil prices and economic instability, confidence begins to drop. And when confidence drops, investment slows. Businesses delay expansion. Innovation takes a back seat. The entire system becomes more cautious, more defensive. So what we're really seeing here is not just an economic reaction, it's a chain reaction of human behavior under pressure. And if we're honest, this reveals something profound about the way our global economy is structured. It is highly efficient, yes, but it is also highly sensitive. It responds quickly to change, but that responsiveness comes with a cost. It lacks resilience. It lacks the ability to absorb shocks without passing them along. So when oil prices rise, the system doesn't contain the impact, it distributes it. And in doing so, it ensures that no one remains untouched. Now here's the critical question we have to ask ourselves. Is this level of vulnerability sustainable? Can an economy truly be considered strong if it can be destabilized by fluctuations in a single resource? Because strength is not just about growth, it's about stability. It's about the ability to endure pressure without collapsing under it. And what an oil crisis reveals time and time again is that our current model, while powerful, is not as stable as we might believe. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that progress without foresight creates fragility, that growth without diversification creates risk, and that dependence, no matter how efficient it seems in the moment, always carries a hidden cost. So as we examine the global economic impact of an oil crisis, we begin to see that it is not just an external shock, it is a mirror. It reflects the strengths and weaknesses of the systems we have built. It shows us where we are prepared and where we are not. And perhaps most importantly, it challenges us to rethink what we define as economic success. Is it rapid growth at any cost? Or is it sustainable stability that can withstand uncertainty? Because in the end, an economy that cannot endure disruption is not truly strong. It is simply untested. And the oil crisis is the test we keep failing until we decide to build something stronger. Now let's bring this closer to home, because up to this point, it might still feel like we're talking about systems, markets, and governments. But the true weight of an oil crisis is not measured in policy papers or economic reports. It is felt in everyday life in quiet, personal ways that rarely make headlines, but shape how people live, think, and move through the world. When oil prices rise, the first thing most people notice is fuel. The cost of filling a car, running a motorcycle, or paying for public transport begins to climb. And at first, it may seem manageable, just a slight adjustment, a little more spending here and there. But then it continues. Week after week, the increase doesn't reverse. And slowly, what was once a minor inconvenience becomes a financial burden. But fuel is only the beginning. Because every product we use, food, clothing, electronics, relies on transportation at some stage. Trucks, ships, planes, they all depend on energy. So when fuel becomes more expensive, the cost of moving goods rises, and that cost doesn't disappear. It is passed along step by step until it reaches the consumer. This is when people begin to feel the squeeze in a deeper way. Groceries cost more, basic necessities become harder to afford. And what makes this especially challenging is that incomes often do not rise at the same pace. So there's a gap that begins to form, a gap between what people earn and what they need to spend. And in that gap, something shifts psychologically. People begin to make different choices. They delay purchases. They cut back on non-essential expenses. They prioritize survival over comfort. And while that may sound like a rational response, and it is, it also reflects a deeper truth. When resources become uncertain, human behavior becomes more cautious, more constrained. Now let's consider the industries that sit behind these daily experiences. Transportation is one of the most directly affected. Airlines face higher fuel costs, which leads to more expensive tickets and reduced travel demand. Shipping companies struggle to maintain margins, which disrupts global trade. Even local delivery services begin to feel the pressure, and that affects how quickly and affordably goods reach consumers. Agriculture is another sector deeply tied to oil. Modern farming depends on fuel for machinery, irrigation, and the transportation of crops. When oil prices rise, the cost of producing food increases, and once again, that cost is passed down the chain. So the price of something as essential as food becomes linked to fluctuations in energy markets. Manufacturing, too, feels the impact. Factories rely on energy to operate, to produce, to maintain efficiency. When energy becomes expensive, production costs rise. Some companies reduce output, others increase prices, and some, unable to adapt, shut down altogether. This is how an oil crisis begins to influence employment. Jobs are not just numbers, they are livelihoods, families, futures. And here's where we begin to see the full picture. The oil crisis is not just economic, it is human. It affects how people eat, how they travel, how they work, and how they plan their lives. But there's another layer to this that is often overlooked: the emotional and psychological toll. When the cost of living rises and financial pressure builds, stress follows. Uncertainty grows. People begin to worry, not just about today, but about tomorrow. And when enough individuals feel that pressure, it shapes the mood of an entire society. Confidence declines, optimism weakens. And when people lose confidence in stability, it affects how they engage with the world around them. Now think about what this means in a broader sense. A crisis that begins in oil markets eventually influences human behavior at every level. It changes not just what we can afford, but how we think, how we feel, and how we respond to uncertainty. And this brings us to a deeper realization. Our daily lives are far more interconnected with global systems than we often acknowledge. The price you pay at a local market is not just a reflection of local conditions. It is tied to decisions, events, and forces happening across the world. So when we talk about the effects of an oil crisis, we are really talking about the intersection of global systems and personal realities. We are talking about how large-scale decisions translate into small-scale consequences. And this is where awareness becomes powerful. Because once you understand this connection, you begin to see that these challenges are not random. They are part of a pattern, a system that links energy, economy, and everyday life. The question then becomes, how do we respond? Do we simply adjust, absorb the pressure, and wait for stability to return? Or do we begin to think differently about how we live, how we consume, and how we prepare for the future? Because every crisis carries a lesson. And the lesson here is not just about rising prices, it's about vulnerability, adaptation, and the need for resilience at every level, from industries down to individuals. In the end, the oil crisis reminds us of something simple but profound. The systems that power our world also shape our lives, and if we don't learn to adapt to those systems, we will always be at their mercy. So after understanding the causes, and after feeling the weight of the consequences, both in the global economy and in our daily lives, we arrive at the most important part of this conversation. What do we do about it? Because insight without action is incomplete. Awareness by itself does not create change. It only creates the possibility of change. And the truth is, the oil crisis is not a problem that will resolve itself simply with time. It requires intention. It requires a shift, not just in policy, but in mindset. The first step forward is diversification of energy. For too long, the global system has leaned heavily on a single dominant resource. And as we've seen, that kind of dependence creates vulnerability. Renewable energy sources, solar, wind, hydro, are no longer distant ideas. They are practical, scalable solutions. But here's the challenge. Adopting them is not just a technical decision, it's a psychological one. Because change requires letting go of what feels familiar. Oil has been reliable, predictable, deeply integrated into our systems. Moving away from it requires trust in alternatives and, more importantly, patience during the transition. It's not an overnight shift, it's a process. But every system that exists today was once an idea that required commitment before it became reality. And this brings us to the second part of the solution, long-term thinking. One of the root causes of recurring crises is our tendency to prioritize short-term gains over long-term stability. It's easier to maintain what already exists than to invest in what might take years to fully develop. But that mindset is exactly what keeps us locked in cycles of vulnerability. True resilience is built in advance. It is designed before the crisis, not during it. Governments, industries, and institutions must begin to think beyond immediate outcomes. Energy policies must reflect not just current needs, but future risks. Infrastructure must be designed to adapt, not just to function, and investments must be guided by sustainability, not just profitability. But let's not stop at institutions, because change at the global level is often driven by pressure from the individual level. There is a role for each of us in this transformation. The way we consume energy, the choices we make in transportation, the awareness we bring to our daily habits, all of these contribute to the larger system. And while one individual action may seem small, collective behavior shapes demand, and demand shapes markets. This is where responsibility becomes personal, not in a burdensome way, but in an empowering one, because when you understand that your choices are part of a larger pattern, you begin to see that you are not just affected by the system, you are also influencing it. Another critical part of the solution is innovation. Every major shift in history has been driven by the willingness to explore new possibilities. The challenge is not the absence of ideas, it is the hesitation to pursue them fully. Investment in research, in clean technologies, in energy efficiency, these are not just technical strategies, they are commitments to a different future, and innovation thrives in environments where people are willing to question the status quo. So we must ask ourselves, are we willing to challenge the systems we have inherited? Are we willing to rethink what we consider normal? Because the solutions to the oil crisis will not come from repeating the same patterns. They will come from redefining them. There is also a need for global cooperation. Energy is not confined by borders, and neither are its consequences. When one region experiences disruption, others feel the impact. So solutions must be collaborative. Nations must move beyond competition when it comes to sustainability and begin to recognize shared responsibility. Because in a connected world, isolation is an illusion. Now, beneath all these solutions, renewable energy, policy reform, innovation, cooperation, there is a deeper shift that must take place, and that shift is in awareness. We must begin to see energy not just as a resource, but as a foundation of stability. We must recognize that the choices we make today shape the conditions we will live in tomorrow. And we must understand that resilience is not built by avoiding challenges, but by preparing for them. The oil crisis in many ways is a warning, not just about energy, but about the consequences of imbalance, of relying too heavily on one path without exploring others. And every warning carries an opportunity to rethink, to rebuild, and to realign with a more sustainable direction. So the question is not whether solutions exist, they do. The question is whether we are willing to act on them with consistency, with commitment, and with clarity of purpose. Because change does not happen when it is convenient. It happens when it becomes necessary, and we decide not to wait any longer. And if there is one thing this entire conversation should leave you with, it is this. The future of energy is not something we inherit. It is something we create. And the decisions we make today will determine whether that future is defined by crisis or by resilience.